We're on.
We are on. We're back. We're back again. My turn.
It's your turn. It's all
My
about
turn
self-talk
to-
today, which I'm actually quite excited about.
Yeah, I'm kind of nervous actually. I hope this goes down well. It's a
Of
combination of
course
a
it
fair bit of
will.
work.
I mean, it's what, a year and a half of kind of planning and familiarizing yourself with it.
Yeah,
It's like your
and
baby. You're,
it's one of those weird ones where like you put so much work into one sort of aspect of one thing specifically, and then when it comes out, you're kind of like, oh, okay, there it is, cool, and it's all compiled, and here's the summary of all the stuff, and this is great. But then you kind of think, well, is anyone actually going to be even semi interested in this thing, or is this just going to be thanks for that assignment, champion? See you later.
I think it's quite interesting because it's self-talk is what we use in everyday lives, no matter who you are. So even if, when you don't know that you're doing it, it's that little voice in your head
Yeah,
always.
yeah. It was funny actually that you say that. A couple of days ago at work, I asked a class if they used self talk at all, and like no more than half put their hands up. And then I said, okay, but how many of you talk to yourself in your own head? And then like 80% put their
Mm,
hand up, and I was like, okay,
yeah.
how many of you can like you talk yourself through what you're doing as you're doing it? And then like pretty much the rest put their hands up. I was like, yeah, it's all the same stuff, right? So even the lingo
Yeah.
is interesting to hear when people chop and change. So that's all right. We'll see. Hopefully some people find this interesting. Even if you find it interesting, that'll make me happy. So
I definitely do find it interesting because there's unhelpful self-talk, and it's, I don't know, from what I know about it is there's no positive and negative because it all like affects people differently. And that's kind of like what I'm really interested about.
all right. Well, this will be interesting. I don't want
Yeah.
to shatter the illusion straight away, but there definitely is positive and negative. Um,
Oh,
but
damn.
yeah, I suppose where do you want to start? Where do you want to kick us off with this? You got anything specific, or are you happy for me to just kind of launch into bits and pieces, see where it takes us?
I guess a good definition of it first, because as you said, there may be people that don't realize what it is. So that would be a good start.
Okay, this is actually harder to start than it sounds because the academic side of things, all the literature that I read through, no one can actually agree on one definition. But
Mm. Hmm.
essentially, self talk is your inner voice. That's kind of the most simplistic
Hmm.
way that we can use that. And depending on how kind of down in the weeds you want to get with specifics and all the rest of that, and tone and everything else. Anyway, we'll get to that. People can't agree on a
Yeah.
definition, but as far as we go, it's basically just the voice in your head that you use for various different things. That's about as simple as I can
Yep.
make it.
Yep. Yep.
Yep. So in an athlete population, estimate was about 80% of athletes use self talk. That was generally found across like meta analyses and things that were done previously. So,
And
which is
is this
pretty
like,
big percentage, really, 8 out of 10.
is this like having the awareness that you're using it or using it in a specific way? Is
Yeah,
that
so
what you mean?
it's a bit of both. So it's you're aware that you're actually engaging in self talk, but you're also actively using it to try to improve your performance too. That was part of it, not just sort
Hmm.
of,
Hmm.
I'm aware that it's there, but I don't really use it. It was like, I am definitely aware that it's there and I'm actively using it to try to get better at something. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
quite
using
high
it
numbers.
as an intervention to help them perform
Yep.
better.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was sort of a broad statistic that I found early on. But essentially the main sort of theory behind it actually stemmed from, I'm gonna stuff all these names up, but I'll give them a crack. Vygotsky, I think, is how it's pronounced. So it's essentially like a really early version of a model of self-talk. So it was essentially like the way that you talk to yourself in your head. He's basically like theorized the
Yeah.
whole thing. In sport, the application of that was then picked up in like the late 80s. And it was like, oh, this can actually be a
Yeah.
cool thing that we can use. And then basically since then, it's just been tweaked and refined over the years and sort of broken down and categorized and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, there's basically overarching categories, and I call them subcategories
Hmm.
of self-talk and the different aspects of it as well.
Wow.
What do you know
There's lots
about it?
of theories. I've kind of come on here as a fresh mind, here to learn more about it. I do know the basics about it. I do know the basic theories. I do know the negative and positive types of self-talk, and how it can impact different people differently. But more than that, I'm not too sure about.
All right, cool. So I can just rip in. Um,
I
okay,
reckon you should just rip in.
so normally when we sort of look at so I suppose broad overarching categorization of self-talk, it was separated into I sort of split it into a bit of a quadrant for the review,
Mm-hmm.
because it was positive and negative was coming up just everywhere. That was super common. But the other one that was the other two things that were really, really common was instructional or motivational. So
Mm-hmm.
instructional self-talk being you're running yourself through in your head the technical aspects of a
Yeah.
specific move, technique, whatever it is, but it's step-by-step instructions. So
Yeah.
really quite task focused in its application, which we know is very, very helpful for athletes to be task focused. It gets them engaged in the present moment. It's almost like that mindful technique of like, what are you actually doing
Yeah.
right now, rather than trying to skip ahead to outcome focus. So that was one. Motivational, your standard sort of, you got this kind of self narrative that people can run through.
Let's
And
do
then
it.
obviously,
Yeah.
yep, let's do it. And then if you run with positive and negative tone to motivational, that can kind of impact it too. So there was a series of athletes that used negative motivational self-talk as a proposed means of actually spurring them along and trying to sort of giving them a bit of a push. And
Yeah.
interestingly, the research up until about 2011, it basically suggested
Mm-hmm.
that negative self-talk was detrimental. So if I'm engaging in negative
Yeah.
self-talk,
Yeah.
it's not good for my performance. There's going to be dips. What
Mm-hmm.
actually happened was, when a previous review was done, was that negative self-talk had no impact on performance. It actually just didn't do
Oh.
anything. It was just irrelevant, really. So, which is
Mm-hmm.
really cool, because if you're working with an athlete, or if someone's listening and they engage in negative self-talk, you can take some level of comfort in knowing that it's actually not making you worse. Or, well, it might be. Who knows? The odds are, based on the research, that it's not making your performance any worse, which I thought was really,
Yeah,
really
that's so
cool.
interesting.
Mm.
See, I read that as well, and um through the research I've done on self-talk, but I didn't realize that it seems like they've interpreted it wrong. Is that what they've done? Or have they just thought no response is just a negative effect?
So the one that Todd and Hardy and Hall and a couple of like really big names in self talk, they've put heaps of research out there.
Mm.
What they actually suggested was that it was almost like the categorization of negative self talk was
Yep.
it wasn't wrong, but it was like with the definition stuff, it's kind of back and forth a fair bit. But some studies showed very small declines in performance, but the overarching systematic review, when you
Mm.
accounted for mediators and moderators as well, then basically it was like,
Mm.
okay, look, it's not actually that detrimental. There's like no effect, really, no effect size at all for
So
negative self
the
talk.
effect size was quite small.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
Mm-hmm.
was which is super cool, because I know personally, I still to this day will engage in some pretty savage self talk. Where like
Yeah.
there is zero chance I would say that out loud to anybody else. There's no way. And
Yeah.
sometimes I catch myself and I think, fucking hell, man, like that's pretty harsh. Like, just, ease up a little bit. But it was also good to know that through, years and years ago when I was engaging in that stuff, it probably didn't have that much of an impact on my performance. If it's, it has other impacts on you, self-esteem and your self-confidence and things like that, which I'll get to in a minute. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's super interesting to me. And I'm just curious, what was your research topic?
So it was the effectiveness of self-talk in athletes.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
so I wanted to
So
actually,
it was broad.
it was very broad. So there was a systematic review done back in 2011, and it was like Todd et al. 2011. I wrote that 1,000 times. It's like etched into my brain now. Um, but they basically looked at the effectiveness of self talk in sport, and I wanted to go sort of similar with that, but it was about 11, 12 years ago now that they did theirs, and I've always been keen on the topic, but I thought it would be interesting to look at if there'd been any changes or any shifts in the rhetoric within the space. Because like with most research, like things sort of shift and change as time goes on, and things become relevant that weren't relevant, 10 years ago, and vice versa. So yeah, that was sort of the goal to start with. I originally actually looked at what assessment tools there were for self-talk. And it turns
Yeah.
out there's actually heaps of them. Funnily enough, all basically designed by these big dogs within the space of self-talk, all these gurus. So,
Hmm.
which all these names feel so familiar to me now. It's really weird. I feel like I know these people in a weird way. But I've read so much of their stuff. But there was actually just not enough research out there to investigate the effectiveness of the questionnaires themselves. So I then pivoted to just
Mm.
sort of refresh the decade old systematic review. So that was the idea behind it.
Wow. I love that. It's so interesting. I feel like your topic was just, it's really broad, but it's really needed at the same time. And I feel like what you're doing is adding value into the world of self-talk.
It's nice to, because like some of the textbooks and stuff that we've been through over the years
Mm.
is you look at it and you think, how the hell do people get to this point? Which is compilation of all this stuff. I was reading it was a meta-analysis of a meta-analysis of, and it was like this massive systematic review of sports psych interventions the other day between 1985 and 2022. It was massive. There
Jeez.
was a whole heap of stuff in there. And it was
Mm-hmm.
fascinating to look at and just think, how cool is it that we're in a space where someone can say, right, let's compile everything that we know about all the things. So it's in one paper, and everyone can just kind of take
Mm-hmm.
that and digest it and save themselves decades of learning and understanding and trial and error and all the rest of it, and then apply the things that work the best. And it was
Yeah.
fascinating to look through. It's awesome.
So you would have learned a lot from the whole process and that and stuff like that.
Yeah, I definitely did. It was one of those things where you go into I don't know if you do this, like it just even through masters as well, but it's like, here's this assignment, and you read the assignment, and any uni student will probably resonate with this, but you read the assignment sort of guidelines and you look at it and you think, shit, really? Like, come on, man. Like, are we really doing this? But then about halfway through, something happens that is actually quite interesting, or you learn something that you didn't expect to learn. And then it's like, oh shit, this is actually pretty cool and kind of interesting. And I find
It's
that
pretty much at the end.
yeah, right towards the end when you get the good stuff. But I sort of like pub test it. So I have like my own version of the pub test. Whereas like
Hmm.
if I'm at a pub with a couple of mates, which I did this the other weekend, and then I find myself talking about the thing. So I just started talking about self-talk with some random people. And then in my head, I was like, okay, it's a bit nerdy. Number one, I don't know how interested they are in it, but I'm going to tell them anyway. But number two, that's such a cool thing to have happen. Whereas like I've now got all this knowledge of this one super niche topic because of a uni assignment that at first I looked at and was like, ugh, this is going to be so dry and boring. And now
For
I'm
sure.
trying to explain self-talk to people down the pub. This is cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if they
Yeah.
thought it was very cool, but I did. That's fine.
Um, I don't know. I feel like people do with anything psychology anyway, most of the time. They always like engage and want to know more. With self-talk,
Mm.
with the negative self-talk, do you have any? neuroscience behind self-talk and how negative or positive self-talk affects your brain.
I wish I did.
And-
I wish I did. I tried to search for it,
mm-hmm.
but it was either it had not been studied, it's too hard to study, or it was just sort of locked away in some dark room somewhere. Because the thing is, and this is one of the major criticisms of self talk research, was it is so subjective. So like
Yeah.
initially I collected 100 there's like 130 odd studies or something that sort of fit my criteria, my search criteria. But after I did all the elimination stuff and the things that didn't match and whatever else, I got it down to participants that were randomly assigned, and I had
Mm-hmm.
13 left over. That was it.
Yeah.
Out of
Yeah.
all of that, the second tier, I had 28 ish, like really good quality papers, but
Mm-hmm.
there was no random assignment, and the subjectivity of self talk itself it's really like it's hard to measure, but it's also really hard to report on any findings because unless you've got some sort of system in there, it's like, well, here's some stuff that we found, and everyone's like, yeah, but what about that? And they're like, oh, we didn't do that. So like the subjective
Yeah.
nature of the whole thing is really difficult. And it's where, are you at training? Are you in competition when they're doing the assessments? A lot of it is self-report stuff. So there's a fair bit of that goes on too. So one of the biggest
Mm.
criticisms that came out of the whole thing, which was across the board, was so researcher I hope I'm saying it right. Anyway, she sounds awesome. She's done heaps of stuff in the space. She developed a model, the sports specific model of self talk, which is supposed to act as some sort of framework that people can then
Mm-hmm.
build on just to give some level of consistency across the space.
Yeah.
In the last decade, of all the research that I looked at, no one used it, not a single person.
Mm.
And it was like,
Yeah.
man, come on, like, what are you doing? Can we get some
Yeah.
consistency so that in another 10 years when another master student comes through and says, oh, I'm going to write on this, there is some sort of objective finding that might come out of something rather than just being like, it's all sort of subjective hearsay. So
Yeah.
anyway, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I'm on my soapbox now. You got me all riled up.
I know. I'm like, geez, passionate
Okay.
coming out of this.
I'll just
No,
take a breath.
I love it. I love when you get like this. So, what were your findings? Can you summarize them in a nice little, you know?
Okay. So main findings were that essentially any type of self-talk is going to be helpful to some extent. That's what
Yep.
they were my findings from this go round.
Yep.
Um, Positive and negative as the main focus of the research was almost non-existent. So, which I found fascinating because
Wow.
the decade before it was massive. That was kind of like the hot topic.
Yep.
This time around as well, motivational versus instructional had also flipped. So back in the day,
Yep.
motivational it was the bee's knees. Everyone was saying positive motivational self-talk that's where it's
Yeah.
at. Recently, over the last decade, at least with the papers I looked at, instructional was everywhere. It was in like 11 or 12 out of the 13 that I ended up looking at. And every single one of them had crazy high effect sizes. Like they were massive. The
Wow.
average, the average effect size across all studies was 1.35. So to put this into context for people,
Mm.
we basically the measure that we use for this is either Cohen's D or Hedges G. It's all statistical stuff. Don't worry about it. But basically, they measure it from a scale of sort of like 0 to 1. If it's zero point 0.2
Mm-hmm.
or below, it's considered low. So there's basically no effect really. Like it doesn't really do
No
anything.
effect in the population.
Yep.
Yeah.
0.5, you're looking at sort of moderate effect. So, like some people it'll be good, some people won't, that sort of thing. 0.8 or above is considered large effect. So that's, you're pretty likely to have some sort of result on the other end. So when we're looking at 1.35 as an average, that is way, way above it. So essentially what we're saying is if you use instructional or motivational styles of self-talk, you're pretty damn likely to see a positive outcome to your performance.
Mm-hmm.
That was essentially the summary of the whole thing, which was like I just found mind-boggling, really, because you never see, or sorry, never's not right. You hardly ever see effect sizes above one. So
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's insane. Because like, why do you know why that is? Like, is that because instructions kind of, I guess, step by step, you're focusing on what you're thinking about or what you're tough to do? So it's like, I don't know. Do you have an answer for that?
I've got a theory. It wasn't laid out very clearly, but I've got a theory about it, and it was sort of split into two. So instructional will improve your skill execution, instructional self talk, which has sort of flow on effects from that, which I'll get to in a second. Motivational self talk will boost your self confidence. So,
Mm-hmm.
which is going to be good for any athlete, like confidence boost and self efficacy and like Bandura's theory and stuff. We've been through that. Like that is proven to work in athletes to improve performance. But essentially, my working theory is the improvements that you get from engaging in instructional self talk
Mm-hmm.
actually have positive sort of flow on effects to your skill execution, which builds your
Mm-hmm.
competence in the space or
Mm,
at doing the thing, which then builds your confidence, which then improves the whole thing.
okay.
So it sort of spins that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so just so I understand it better, I just want to see if this example is what you're talking about so I can kind of understand it. So I'm thinking about my own training, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm going to hit a PB. So a day before, I will be like motivational self-talk. I can do it. I'm gonna get in there. I'm gonna kill it. I can lift the weight considering what I lifted before, like blah blah blah. Then when I'm in the gym and when I'm about to do the lift, then it's like, all right, is my back activated? Is my like I go through the steps in my head of what I need to check off right before I do the lift. Would that be what you're kind of talking about?
Yeah. So that's
Or
exactly
do I have
right.
it
So the
completely wrong?
no, that's spot on. So the technical cues that you're running yourself through, that is exactly what
Mm,
we're referring to as the instructional side of that self talk. So
okay.
yeah, like
Yep.
the deadlift, like locking your lats in,
Hmm.
whatever it is, heels, screwing the heels in the ground, like whatever
Yeah, like I
cues you
start,
use.
yeah, like I'll start from the ground up and I'll it's like one, two, three, four, like steps that I'll go through quickly, run through my head, and make sure that I'm doing them. And then it creates like a body and mind awareness, and I'm kind of talking to myself. And then the last thing I do is like kind of like a motivational, let's go, let's push this weight type of
Let's
thing.
go. Let's lift
So
this
I don't
shit.
know, is that both?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So you can engage in both. But what's sort of I suppose an alternate scenario is that you would engage in the instructional self talk about the cues. So you'd engage
Mm-hmm.
in all the cues before the lift. If the lift then
Yep.
didn't get off the ground, you would then revisit and then potentially even engage in some motivational self talk at that point as a confidence boost. Because if it doesn't come off the
Yep.
ground, then you're gonna feel probably a little bit deflated, I would assume, afterwards. So then you'd want to engage in the
Yeah. Well,
motivational side of things. So they both have their
yep.
uses depending on context. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm reflecting on last time I couldn't lift it, and there's a little part of me that was like, damn. But then I just had a rest and I was just like, I'm like, nah, you can do it. You can do it. Like you can do it. A little and then after the rest, I did it and I succeeded. But yeah, there's like a split second where you're in the gym, you're like, oh no, everyone's looking at me. I didn't lift it. And then
Yeah.
it's your mind can spiral quite quickly and go into kind of a negative cycle, and you can either give up or try rebuild yourself and rebuild that self-talk. So yeah, it's really interesting because now I'm like reflecting on my own experiences to kind of understand what you're talking about. Uh, yeah, it's
Yeah,
pretty cool.
that's a really good example though of the sort of the difference between the two. The other thing that was really interesting that a couple of studies found was when people, specifically coaches, are providing feedback to athletes, the
Mm,
what they called like the normal ways of feedback delivery were insufficient compared to an instructional mode of feedback. So, a tennis player with a serve, rather than just that sort of whatever they consider to be standard feedback, most of it was kind of like, you need to do this or your energy's low or da 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 da. It was all these things that they were too broad, they weren't specific enough. When they provided
yeah.
very technical instructional feedback, the athletes took that on board more so and were able to make the
Mm,
adjustments, which then improved the confidence moving forward. So if there's any coaches out there, it's something to consider as well. Just in your feedback as you're giving it to the athletes, consider the content of your feedback, or any PTs or coaches or anyone else out there is working in any space where there's any sort of technical aspect. Think about the actual content that you're giving your athletes regarding feedback, because
hmm.
if it's not working, you can alter it. And instructional, the research suggests, is a very, very helpful way to get them to fix things up, which then enhances the confidence as a flow on effect of that. So,
Yeah, I've really enjoyed listening to this topic. Like, I love it so much. And I'm glad I could reflect on my own experience only because then it helps me understand the experiences of athletes that I'm going to help in the future as well. And yeah, it's good to have, I guess, good research behind what works and what doesn't work, especially with such a large effect size for instructional. Yeah, that's going to benefit me and help my clients with their performance and self
yeah,
talk.
definitely. Definitely. I thought it was a mistake at first. I went back and redid the calculations like 3 or 4 times because, like, surely not. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank
But
you.
I
Thank you for
suppose
sharing.
just as one thing to finish up on so that people can take it away is, if you're unsure about what kind of self talk you engage in, just draw up the quadrant. So it's literally just like draw up 4 squares
Square.
and or one big square. Yep. And just have motivational, instructional, and then positive and negative. Just slot those into each sort of top and bottom, and then just pay attention to what you're saying to yourself during a training session or a competition, and come back and just sort of fill it in. Where was I at certain points? It's a good little exercise just to kind of highlight, because a lot of the time we just do stuff, we don't really think about it. But it's a really good exercise just to get some of that. I suppose it's reflection really on what you're actually engaging in the space and whether it needs to be tweaked or not. Ideally, both of them are going to work and it's going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But we just, yeah, it's something for people to focus on. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, self awareness comes first. So once you kind of can identify what type of self talk you engage in, and look, you'll probably engage in different ones at different times. But once you know what you commonly use, is it that's when you can like kind of work on it if you need to anyway.
100%. Good,
Cool.
good.
Well, thank
All
you for
right.
sharing. That was awesome. I feel like I'm leaving this podcast with a brain full of knowledge, which I love.
Good. I like that. Hopefully some other people are too. That's good.
I loved it. I loved it so much. Thank you.
Cool. All good. All right. Thank you, crew. We will tune in again next week.
Yeah. Have a good week. Bye.
Peace out.